it's not really just about advocacy and practice expansion. It's really about protecting what we already have. New technologies, regulations, and other professions moving vertically in our profession also pose a risk. So it's also about protecting what we have as well.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned predatory bills, and they, a lot of, I think especially students don't realize how hard some of our, colleagues that came before us fought to get what we have. We just kind of assume we always had it. But legislatively, you can lose those rights. We can be excluded from things. We can be excluded from healthcare bills going forward. We almost were excluded from Obamacare and some other things like that. So why is it so important for students to understand the process when they're in school?
Well, it works. It happens like that in the real world. When I was fresh out of school, I actually was with an ophthalmologist in upstate New York, and I was excluded from certain medical panels. He had a lot of managed Medicaid, and I think there were 1 out of 4 of the ones that he was on refused to let me on. We called up the medical director of all 3 of those. We wound up talking to legal counsel through the NYSOA. There's different interpretations of those statutes in Obamacare. So they're called, I think they were the Harkin Amendments. And based on those interpretations, insurance companies can interpret those almost how they would like to. So in certain circumstances, we were included, and in certain circumstances, we weren't. So fresh out of school, it was something I faced almost immediately.
You mentioned getting involved in AOSA and things like that in school. Do you believe that's the best way for students to really understand this process and start kind of seeing the political side of our profession? Are there other ways to do that?
I think it's a great way. I was involved in Student Optometric Service for Humanity. I didn't do much with AOSA, with the exception of that trip. Obviously, the earlier the better. That being said, on day 1, I had graduated. My dad had practiced for about 30 years. I went with him to our local society meeting, and they were more than happy to have me there. I was younger than a lot of the ODs by a few decades, and right away they kind of welcomed me in. Now I'm the vice president of the Hudson Valley Optometric Association, and I'll be there on lobby day. So
that's fantastic. I think a lot of people liken getting involved in politics to just having to shell out a bunch of money, right? But there's a lot of other things that we can do as students, but definitely as new graduates and on into our career. Can you kind of touch on what you've found to be some of the more effective ways to communicate our goals outside of just donating?
Well, one of the first things is relationships, which is one of the most important things. One of the first people that I had visited was Senator Sue Serino, and I wasn't in her district. Now, I was fresh out of school. She was very nice. I was nervous to see her, almost like she was a queen. I was going to go see a legislator. But she's a person, and she goes grocery shopping, and she does all the same things that we do. Now, she wound up supporting us, but what she did say was, at the very end, she goes, by the way, where are the ODs from my district? Because I wasn't in her district. So being involved in the people in your district is very important, even if it just means calling and saying, hey, could you please support this bill? If it means sending an email or a letter, showing up is fantastic as well. So organizing with your local society and going as a group is also a great way to start.
How do you even get started with setting up a meeting? How do you find that person? How do you contact them? I think a lot of people think, like you said, that there's somehow these out of reach people that we can't communicate with, but that's definitely not the case. So how do you go about doing that?
Well, they do have a staff there, so you can contact the chief of staff. It's usually best to do it through the local society, organize and find out those things. The head of your local societies, NYSOA, local organizations, they'll be able to point you in the right direction if you're not really sure where to start.
Yeah, absolutely. Alabama's the same way. We have someone designated within the Alloway to basically keep tabs on exactly what's going on in our political action committees every day. They know exactly who needs to be contacted, who your district is, things like that. Some of the information that can be a little tougher to sometimes find on your own. And that person is so helpful and ready to give you all of that information. You just have to ask for it. So completely agree with that. Some of the schools will support trips to DC and things of that nature. Do you think that's worthwhile for a student to get involved in?
Absolutely. There was another trip that I had done. It was the first one I'd ever done down in DC. And they actually supported us. They actually paid for the trip. They gave us a grant. We were able to go down there. And then we were able to go into the halls and actually lobby with senators and representatives down there under the guidance of people who had already met with these types of people. So you kind of learn the ropes and learn how to discuss things with those people, and it really makes it a lot easier.
Yeah, I think it's important to do that when you're a student too, and maybe couple that with, if you can, with some ODs that have been doing it for a little while, because you can kind of learn the ropes from them and see, some of the ways that they interact with these people and really, communicate their point to get the ball rolling and make a difference. So what about the colleagues of ours that maybe aren't so in touch with this or aren't so passionate about it as we are, think that I don't really need to worry about that, somebody else will handle it?
Well, there is some sense of complacency sometimes. It really depends on where people come from and where they're practicing. Private practice comes with its own responsibilities. If you have a family, you're running other organizations, doing things for your own business. When you work for an MD, it kind of already gives you a scope expansion in the nature of working for them. But our diagnostics, our therapeutics, all the things that we use during our daily exams are things that people fought for at some point. Being complacent can change things, especially as new things come around the bend. We don't want to be excluded from those sorts of things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they, as a generality, like you said, a lot of people in our profession are complacent, or they're just very focused on their part of the world and not so much what's going on outside of it, and sometimes you can lose sight of how important it is to keep moving forward and to make sure we don't slide backwards. A lot of language in these laws that were written 20, 30, 40 years ago and haven't been updated, and maybe that's okay if they wrote it really, really well, but in most cases that's not the case. It needs to be updated and looked at, and people can actually pull those bills. You can ask your state association for your actual legal language to look over and see if maybe you think that with fresh eyes and new graduates especially, that you think that might need to be updated, right?
Exactly.
So what would you say is the biggest challenge that we have as a profession towards scope expansion and advocacy?
Well, in terms of scope expansion and advocacy, obviously getting people out there, but something that people might not realize is that when you go to meet with these people, sometimes they'll agree with you and sometimes they won't. They have to do what's best for their constituents. But when you show up, now there was a specific example that I had of someone whose district I was in when we went to go visit him. He was going to support us anyway, and he inevitably did, but his answer was, so-and-so in my party is supporting us, so I'm going to support you too. I'm going to follow the party line. It was great that he supported us, but that was an answer I was surprised to hear. So sometimes it's not about common sense legislation and helping your constituents. It's, what's the party doing, and that's what they're going to do. So that could definitely be a hurdle.
Yeah, that's true. You don't think of optometry as being a right or left thing, right? Like you definitely don't think about that being a party line
Exactly.
divider.
It should be bipartisan, and it's common sense legislation. It's one of those things where sometimes I was surprised in that circumstance.
Yeah, you would definitely think that. What about, we fight hard, we try to get something passed, and it doesn't. What then? What do we do at that point?
Well, persistence is definitely something that optometry has to do. It's a legislative profession. We've fought for what we have already. New York is a great example. We've got two bills up this year, 1193 and 4032, if I have that right, for our orals. The past 3 years, we've come pretty darn close. We've got it through the Senate. It's gotten stuck in the House Higher Education Committee, and it's gotten stuck there. We haven't been able to force it to the floor for a vote. So those sorts of hurdles, being persistent and re-strategizing every year is helpful. We have new lobbyists this year and an exciting executive director that has a lot of great ideas. So I'm optimistic about this year. So.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Being in Alabama, our past governor was an MD by profession. He was an ophthalmologist, but he was an MD, and so his background kind of naturally tend to side a little bit more with ophthalmologists, and so we knew that going forward, and that definitely affected how we presented certain things at certain times. And you kind of have to play the game a little bit. It is politics, but it also gave us a lot of insight into how to make sure that we were still getting where we needed to get, knowing the audience that we were addressing, right? So I think that's a big part of it, getting to know these people, know their background, know why they're doing it, whether it's just party or if they really are interested particularly in healthcare or whatever it may be, and then connecting with those people on that level, right?
Absolutely. Those personal connections are not something that you could replace. So starting early and calling them up and really getting to know these people definitely helps.
And remembering that it can change in 2 years or 4 years, whenever the next election is, right?
Absolutely. It's something that changes. It's not something that's set in stone. So it's definitely something that can change.
Yeah, you mentioned Dr. Gowdy and their team lobbying in Kentucky, and obviously that was a very successful, thankfully, run that they had. What do you think we can learn from some of the most recent changes that we've had in states like Kentucky and Georgia and a few others?
Well, I think it shows that the profession's not stagnant. It took us a really long time. Diagnostics came in 71, and I don't think all the states had them until 89. Therapeutics, we were getting them in 76, but I think the last state got it in 98 to some degree. So I'm not delusional that this is going to be a quick change, but it's a slow and arduous journey, and being persistent and making sure that people, when they're coming out of school, are staying involved and getting involved is definitely going to propel it in the future.
I was in a discussion with some people last night about a children's vision bill that's being put out there in a few different states, and some challenges that they were coming up against. And I think when people think about scope of practice, we just think about therapeutics or lasers or injections, minors, those sort of things, and we forget about some of the other things that we need to be addressing as well, whether it's expanding healthcare to those groups that need it, or we passed a bill in Alabama that had to do with over-the-counter readers, because there were some companies that were trying to change how things were done, and we didn't agree with the way that was going. Why is it important that we don't just focus on those medical things that we can do or can't do, that we look at the whole entire picture?
Well, because there are a lot of different things that affect our profession. For one, the Docs Access bill works with the dentist, and they get forced on some dental plans, and we get forced on some vision plans in order to get on medical panels in certain situations when that shouldn't be the case. We get forced to accept discounted procedures for things that we don't actually offer, and it kind of pigeonholes us to do certain things that we may or may not want to be doing. So to have that freedom is definitely important.
You mentioned earlier in just talking that there's some bills that actually are supported by ophthalmology, right? Which is something we don't really think about, right? It's usually us versus them in most people's minds. How can we utilize some of the MDs in our community to actually support some of the things that we want to do?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that, because you also touched upon the fact that things can change and there's an ebb and flow in politics. Our bill in New York State is something that's a negotiated bill with ophthalmology, which is ironic because we haven't been able to get it through the House the past 3 years, and it had nothing to do with the fact that the ophthalmologists were fighting us. They actually wrote the bill with us. The head of the Ophthalmology Association in New York was someone who was actually friendly with one of the higher-ups in the NYSOA and helped to push it through. Now, that gentleman is not going to be in that position forever, so that's definitely a concern, and eventually when he leaves, that's something that will, if we don't have it pushed through by then, we might have to re-strategize.
Yeah, so do you know, did a group of optometrists approach a group of ophthalmologists and that to get that ball rolling? Did it go through the local societies or the state society? Do you know how that kind of formulated?
That I actually don't know. But that being said, you had mentioned before about personal relationships, and we'd touched upon that numerous times. Someone had knew someone and got the ball rolling, and then their different committees got together and probably formulated that, the bill as it is right now.
Yeah, we talk a lot about forming those co-management relationships from a patient care standpoint, right? That when you establish yourself in a city or a town, finding the ophthalmologist that you trust, getting to know them on more than just I send them my patients and that's the end of the day type relationship. And it expands into these sort of things, right? Because if we can have that candid conversation about why we are wanting to do these things, it makes it a lot easier for them to understand and back what we're trying to get, right?
Exactly. I mean, it's a really good symbiotic relationship. Especially where we are in upstate New York, it's a little bit different. So when older ODs came up there, and I said older, so my dad is, he's going to laugh when he hears that, but when these guys came up here, we were excluded from a lot of things. It was like an old boys club. It's a different territory for me now, because I do call the PCP and I'll say, hey, so-and-so has a situation, I think we need to order some blood work, or we need to, have someone on a prophylactic antiviral, something like that, and they'll go ahead and work with me on those sorts of things. But I've come across situations where they're really just not looking to do that. They're going to do their own thing, and sometimes that could definitely be the case.
I thought it was interesting that you mentioned earlier about meeting with, a congressperson that wasn't in your district. A lot of people focus just on their local area. Why is it important to look beyond that and to reach out to those people?
Well, someone has to meet with those representatives, and sometimes that's the case where that doesn't happen. When the last visit that I took to Albany, we were lobbying, and we had plenty of people from the Hudson Valley, and we really were lacking people in the boroughs. And I actually got switched, and I was lobbying with the boroughs, and nobody asked me where I was from or if I was really in the boroughs. But we had a bunch of people with us, and we were able to explain to them on their level and based on their personal histories, something that could relate to them.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think they're going to be like, well, you're not from here, so I'm not going to talk to you, right? I mean, that's not how it works.
Exactly.
They're mostly just impressed that somebody's taking the time to be involved in something that we care about, right? And that makes a big difference. What would you want to leave to our fellow new graduates, to students who are, busy and overwhelmed and trying to figure out their career path and their life and their world and work-life balance and everything else? What would you leave to them to help encourage them to stay involved and remember that this is a very important part of our profession?
It just doesn't take that much time. Sometimes you can get involved in school, sometimes you just show up to the meetings. I know there's a lot going on, but when you get out, joining the AOA is one of the best things that you could do. Right now, the AOA has something called the Young Advocate Committee. In New York, Doctors Marina Sue and Alyssa Punim have done a fantastic job, along with the local trustees and all the different districts that have done a good job of getting young ODs involved. So getting out there and doing those sorts of things are definitely important.
Yeah, I completely agree. Just taking a step, right?
Exactly.
It doesn't have to be huge. You don't have to go spend a week in D.C., but just call your state association and say, what can I do? That's all you got to do.
Another thing also that comes to mind, if you're going to work for someone in a private practice, whether it's for an OD or an MD, you can negotiate your contracts. So one of the things that could be discussed, sometimes, I've heard young doctors say that the AOA is expensive. So when you join these societies, it's tiered. So your first 5 years out of school, it tiers up how much you're going to pay out of your dues. And if you don't ask, you won't receive. So if you say the person that you're making the contract with, I need to be a member of the AOA, it's important for me as a professional and important for my profession, a lot of times you can get them to actually pay for your dues out of from your contract.
That's a really great point. And you're right. If you don't ask, you're not going to receive. Put it out there, especially, if you're coming from a perspective of, I want to be involved in this because I want to make a difference. So therefore, can you help me out a little bit by, dues or giving me the day off when it's legislative day, things like that. But you gotta be vocal if you want to get what you want.
Exactly. You miss 100% of the chances that you don't take.
Exactly. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
And thank you for having me.
Excited to see where things are going.
Absolutely. So am I.
Thanks.